So welcome. My name is Nick Robbins. I'm the chair of the Just Transition Finance Lab. Welcome to our last event of London Climate Action Week. I hope you've been having a great week. And we really want to focus today on the role of people in climate action and also nature action and resilience. How are we going to move forward in terms of the justice dimensions, the fairness dimensions, inclusion, dealing with questions of inequality and poverty in the transition. So just a brief introduction. The Just Transition Finance Lab was established here last year at the LSE, and our aim is to really make this imperative of just transition possible through the realm of finance. We really want to think about how we can transform the world of finance, looking at public finance, development banks, DFIs and so on, but also private finance, the role of investors and banks, and community finance as well. And our focus is really on sort of four main pillars: what it means to do to change particular financial instruments. So we've been producing really interesting work on the bond markets. How do bonds adopt just transition principles? Looking at how we measure just transition. It's a big concept, but how do we measure it? And obviously to get capital flowing, you need to be quite consistent in terms of measurement and metrics. What are the policy frameworks? And governments have the primary responsibility, and particularly we've been working in India, here in the UK, and also internationally. What are the policy regimes? And I'm sure that'll come up today. And then case studies. That's something people ask all the time. Well, just transition sounds great. We believe in it. We want it to happen. But show me where it's happening. And it's really good to have you all in the room, our partners. We have members of our strategy council in the room, our fellows who give of their time freely and with no charge, and then you, our guests, and we hope we can partner with you in the future. Certainly this week in London, I have got a sense that the question of how people are put at the heart of climate and nature action has really come alive. And that's something which is not just in the Just Transition sessions, but I think increasingly for all the reasons that we know, ensuring that the transitions are seen as and felt as fair and just. That is really critical. So before handing over to the panel and so on, I want to talk about the wind, because this session is all about wind. So we're navigating the headwinds, uncertainties and resilience and just transition future. So the headwinds is when the wind is coming into your face and pushing you back. But I think maybe also, I hope will come out, is actually the tailwinds, the ones that are at your back and are pushing you forward. And again, I think we've seen that. So we'll come up suddenly some of the pushbacks, but some of the things that we can really take forward. And certainly we've seen what's happened in the US with the federal administration, taking action domestically, internationally against just transition. But this week I've been talking to South Africa, which is designing a new just transition finance mechanism. So we have the wind is in different directions. And finally, before handing over to the great panel we have, just a sort of a message. One of our members of our Strategy Council, former Environment Minister of Canada, Catherine McKenna, said this week that we're going to have to be tough. So how do we be tough on questions of just transition and ensure that justice is in everything we do, particularly in the finance sector? So again, thank you, welcome. And now I'd like to hand over to my colleague Judith Tyson, who will moderate the session. And I'll come back at the end to do some closing remarks. But look forward to a dynamic session, and you'll have lots of opportunities to contribute. So Judith, to you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that introduction to the lab and to the session. We're going to have a panel discussion around a few of the key topics that we have selected for the panel. I'm going to introduce them in a moment. We're then going to have a Q&A session. In the interest of asking tough questions, I would ask you also to be active in thinking about questions, including difficult ones that we will do our best to answer. On that note, let me introduce the panel. Firstly, we have Celine Tan. Celine is the Professor of International Economic Law and the Co-Director of the Centre for Law, Regulation and Governance of the Global Economy at Warwick Law School. We also have Tom Taylor. I'm sure many of you know him. because he's been so prominent in the private finance space and climate. His formal title is he is the head of international sustainability policy at international. Sorry. Tom is the head of international sustainability policy at Aviva, and he leads Aviva's advocacy with international and multilateral policymakers and regulators on climate change, sustainability and finance. We're then very pleased to have Sarah Collenbrander, who is the Director of Climate and Sustainability Programme at the think tank ODI Global. And she is also currently supporting the Australian government with its preparations for COP this year. And last but not least, my colleague Jodi-Ann Wang, who is our Global Policy Fellow at the Just Transition Finance Lab, and she is working at the intersection of sustainable finance policy and climate justice, and is also heavily involved in the COP thinking and influencing the COP process. So thanks very much to all of our panel. We wanted to start with as kind of overview of the topic for this, which is about the environment for policy making, particularly for the just transition, as we go into the COP process this year and as the negotiations gather momentum. Celine, I don't know if we could start with you. Would you like to give us your take on how you see the environment, including in comparison to other years and the just transition?
Yeah, thanks, Judith. So probably easier. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think. Sorry, is this on? Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So I think the finance discussions at the multilateral level is pretty challenging at the moment, given the environment. I don't know if any of you here are familiar. I mean, some of you might be with the multilateral climate regime. But there's been obviously last year at COP28, we had an agreement, which was a compromise agreement among all the member states of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement to commit to a provision of 300 billion per annum for climate action and finance. This was way short of what countries in the global south, developing countries, had demanded, of 1.3 trillion per annum. So there's obviously that finance gap there. And I think the fight now, and the agreement to then by the COP28 and the COP29 and the COP30 presidencies to consider or to launch discussions on a roadmap to scaling up finance to 1.3 trillion. So there's a huge gap there. And I think the three issues that are in contention with this, and this relates to the finance for just transition, is the quantum. Obviously, that's insufficient. It's non-committal. How do we enforce that? The quality of financing is a huge issue, I think, for developing countries, and particularly in the context of just transition. A lot of the commitments at the moment in climate finance, the majority of them are in the context of loans, in the context that we have a severe sovereign debt crisis that's facing very, very challenging circumstances and unlikely to get any better. Because significant reforms to the international financial architecture, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, I think, is not forthcoming in the current political environment, I think. And also there's a big question mark over the contribution base. So there's a lot of conversations, and I think Tom will pick this up, about getting the private sector on board. And a lot of developing countries, I think, are particularly concerned that this means relieving developed countries from their commitments to provide for, and this is the fight between provision and mobilization of finance. So the commitments that developed countries have made under the convention and under the Paris Agreement for actually provision and guaranteed provision of financing. And I think all these discussions in the multilateral space has to boil down to the fundamental issue of the fact that we have a legal agreement, we have legally binding commitments on the developed states who are the historical and contemporary emitters to provide finance to developing countries for climate actions, and that the developing country member states of that regime, their commitments to undertake climate action in forms of mitigation adaptation is contingent on the provision of financing by the developed countries. So I think we just need to remember this, and the challenges for many, many developing countries right now is this complicated, what is now known as polycrisis, although, you know, developing countries have been in crisis since for the most part of the post-colonial period. I think we need to kind of look at the financing thing as a moral, ethical obligation, but also as a legal obligation from the developed countries to provide financing for developing countries. So there is a big fight that is happening and continues to happen between this demand for provision of finance guarantee for countries to actually meet their legal commitments under the multilateral regime, and the mobilization, because there's a lot of discussion about developed countries wanting to shift their commitments, outsource obligations to the private sector and say, okay, well, we're going to, you know, not guarantee that provision of the financing. We're going to give some incentives to the private sector to, you know, scale up this financing. And in the last few years, I don't think that's happened. So I'm just going to stop there. But just this kind of like context in which we operate under, I think is really important.
Sarah, let me ask you a question. There's a lot of comments or hot takes at the moment around the Trump administration and the impact it's going to have on COP. I was wondering if you'd like to give us your views on how serious we should be taking this, and what do you think will be the effects both sort of short term and long?
Ooh, what a fun question. Firstly, Australians don't generally need a mic, but can I check that the back of the room can hear us okay? Because we are getting some craning heads. So firstly, big thanks to LSE for hosting us today. Such a pleasure to be here. And thank you to all of you on a Friday morning for trekking out to hear about Just Transition Finance. That is commitment to the cause, and we're very impressed. So I really want to start by saying this is what I'm about to say in no way indicates that I am a fan of Trump. Let me just be 100% clear of that. But I do think people who are talking about a very sharp U-turn in American climate policy have a little bit drunk the Kool-Aid of the Democrat administrations of the past. Let us be clear that the US has never been a climate leader. Back in 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated, the US at that point accounted for 4.5% of the global population and 33% of cumulative emissions to date. The numbers have changed now. You know, China and India in particular have seen a huge increase in their emissions. That means that the US, with still about 4.5% of the global population, maybe more like 4%, now only accounts for 25 to 27% of cumulative emissions. But that is still not a just allocation of limited carbon budget. And yet the US repeatedly shows up saying effectively that it will not act on climate change unless emerging economies do so. It has not been wrong to say that others should act, but it has certainly been wrong to drag its feet at home. And early action by the US, with its huge innovative capabilities, its vast market demand, it's no longer quite as dominant, but still very significant manufacturing capabilities, would have done a huge amount to make a just transition more possible for others in terms of the spillovers of what is technologically possible, and the kind of demand that it would have stimulated. Trump, for all his words, coal declined significantly under his first administration. Biden and Obama, for all of their great words, oil and gas expanded significantly under their administrations, and today the US is one of the top producers of both oil and gas. And so I think the main difference with the Trump administration is really that it's stepping out of the multilateral accords. And who was in Bonn over the last couple of weeks for the SBs? Anyone? So you'll have seen that perhaps for the first time, there was no one sitting behind the US flag. So they're not even showing up to participate. So the main change now is that one of the world's biggest economies, by some measures the biggest, one of the world's richest economies, one of the world's most polluting economies, no longer even wants to wear the fig leaf of pretending it has a global commitment to a just transition or indeed to climate action. And in doing so, it gives cover to a lot of other countries that are under pressure to act but don't want to, including my own, including Japan, including a lot of the Gulf states and so on. I do want to pick up, I'm going to ensure not only interaction with you guys, but also interaction with the panel by picking up on some of the comments from Celine, which is to say, I absolutely, and I talked about cumulative emissions, I absolutely feel that historically industrialized countries have an outsized responsibility to show leadership. But I do think this the US is not wrong to say that the fundamental division between developed and developing countries in the climate accords, as gridlocked since 1992 with the same list unchanged of developed and developing countries, is a legitimate problem. So some of the countries that technically qualify as developing today under the UN Climate Convention: South Korea, Singapore, Israel, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE. These are not poor nations, and most of them are not clean nations. And so just to say that on the one hand, there is a need, particularly for a subset of developed countries, again, including my own, but particularly the US, to step up massively on the provision and mobilization of finance. But there is also a need for a conversation about countries that are hiding behind the particularly vulnerable states of the least developed countries and the small island countries. And I hope we can get into a really good conversation today about what a just transition looks like, with some nuance between those different levels of income and responsibility.
Thank you very much. So I'll come back to some of the remarks you made about some larger emerging economies, because I think that's a very interesting theme. Any hot takes on last week in Bonn for the audience?
So just to clarify that Australia is not holding this year's COP. It's next. It's next. They're hoping for next year's COP. So I think Brazil was really hoping to make progress on a couple of outcomes, and last I heard that they had not seen the progress that they made. The other area where there was a hope of progress was certainty about who would host COP31, and between Turkey and Australia, and that has also, to the best of my knowledge, not yet been resolved. So I don't think it's been the most productive week. I'd love to hear fortnight, but I'd love to hear otherwise.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Jodi-Ann, let me ask you. Of course, the lab here is focused particularly on the just transition and the work streams that the UN have been in and out of favour. I was wondering what your take is on the current situation for the just transition.
Thank you. I think every time, yeah. Yes, I think every time the lab hosts an event, we have a good mix of audience, people who are kind of from the just transition human rights space, people from the finance space, and I'm going to particularly speak on the just transition as an agenda and how it leads and links with finance, because personal opinion, kind of in the UNFCCC, the two has been quite siloed, but actually the siloing negatively creates bottlenecks for progress on both tracks. I think the question we have to ask right now is kind of the effectiveness and the ability to operationalize what we actually mean by just transition. And that's kind of, we've been talking about just transition in the UNFCCC space for the last 2 years, dialogues on different topics, people coming in with their opinions, hundreds of submissions and documents, but then it's just dialogue and dialogue and dialogue. So the proposal now on the table before the mandate of the dialogue finishes next year is to create a mechanism, a space where we can kind of hope to have a bit more practical discussions about, where are the projects and what is the financing need and connecting the two. So creating a mechanism within UNFCCC. And that's very much an initiative that's coming out of the civil society space, putting pressure on parties that parties are kind of getting behind, and hopefully before the end of this year, we can see some progress towards that. But taking a step back, because we're talking about headwinds, and within the lab's policy program, what we're thinking about this year is actually what are the headwinds that are materially affecting the just transition agenda? What kind of pressure is it putting on the just transition? Where does responsibility and responsiveness to the agenda is kind of fading away a little bit, and how do we reinforce and making sure that the just transition does not get lost? And some of which Celine and Sarah have already touched on. I think if I could just list them, and I'll actually focus on the last one in particular. There's questions around the political validity of net zero and some of the kind of doubts around cost and debates around cost and the eroding long-term policy frameworks that the just transition very much needs. Sarah touched on kind of political will, backlash, maybe not the material impact of the Trump administration, but the signals and the emptiness and the hysteria that creates, and what does it mean for kind of other people who are at the seat, as well. Shrinking development finance, uneven provision of climate finance, not only between mitigation adaptation, but also kind of the type of finance that's being provided as well, that Celine touched on, and I'll give space for her and Tom to kind of touch on that more. Slow reform to the multilateral development banks, slow reform to the global financial architecture, which I think discussions around that will culminate next week in Seville as well. So that's a space to watch. There's a lot of discussion in the finance space about transparency around the just transition. We have a kind of tendency to rush to find the indicators that will give us the right metric to measure the just transition. But I think, can we really mathematically or like very scientifically create the right indicators, and is that it? And then my opinion is we need to go much more beyond that, because simply having access to the information is not a proxy to actually having a just transition. The last thing that I want to mention, is something that I'll focus a bit more on, is this framing failure, or kind of a very narrow conceptualization of the just transition that have carried us to date, and I think is actually harming us a little bit. And that's linked to the narrow conceptualization of harm and climate harm that we're seeing. And climate litigation has been a key driver to kind of broaden what we mean by harm and give recourse to affected communities. And the same thing with just transition as well. But even in kind of the just transition dialogues, the main bottleneck is actually developing countries conceptualize just transition much more broadly than a lot of the developed countries at the table. If you comb through some of the submissions previously, I remember, the Pacific states are coming and saying just transition for us is actually addressing the issue of like e-waste dumping on our islands, versus in the European Union's about jobs, jobs, jobs. That's not, neither of those are invalid, but I think when the UNFCCC has so much power imbued in it, certain voices are much louder than other voices, and some of the kind of very important priorities are then kind of silenced in the process. Another framing issues that I see is, over time, we're starting to see justice and injustice as mutually exclusive and opposite, and I want to challenge that a little bit. Because last year, if you were at our event, we kind of talked a lot about different types of justice, from procedural to distributive to something that's much broader, like reparative justice. And oftentimes we think that if we just get the distributive justice, and that's very much by our analysis, the most common types of justice that's iterated in policy documents. Not to say that's not important, it's extremely important, but it does not solve the issue. And I think we see a lot of limitations to consultation as a proxy to just transition as well, because there's fundamental challenges to implementing consultation when it comes to kind of time, geographical fragmentations, how many times do you do it, who's at the table, we risk kind of tokenizing stakeholders, and sometimes we do consultations ex ante, but we don't do them ex post, and there's no grievance redressal mechanism. So there's a lot of challenges to kind of distributive and procedural justice, and actually from our analysis previously, something much more systemic like reparations and restorative justice come up much less in policy documents and come up more often in developing countries' just transition documents. And I think that's something that we need to be mindful of, because we spend a lot of time thinking about what justice looks like, the transformative potential of all of that, but we're not really starting with where injustice is happening and how do we confront those very material injustices that's happening on the ground, because there's a time lag. We only know what's injustice when the harm has already happened, right? So if we don't follow those up with redressal and much broader thinking around what the just transition is, then we just end up perpetuating a very uneven system continuously. And I hope that, the just transition was born out of the UNFCCC. It happens outside of the UNFCCC as well. The multilateral climate governance space gives it certain importance to the agenda by institutionalizing it in the convention, but I think we need to also be very mindful of a lot of what communities are already doing and engaging in as well. In terms of the impact that this has on global South countries, and I'll shut up after this, I think no finance and uneven provision of finance has a material negative effect on the just transition, not only because countries are saying, if there's no money on the table, then we cannot afford the transition. That's the grand bargain of the Paris Agreement, right? That's eroding a little bit. That's a very material impact. Something I mentioned earlier as well, the burden of broadening what the just transition means rests on developing countries, and that is a very labor-intensive process as well, and I think has material impact. And my last point is we need to really look backwards before we go forward when it comes to the just transition agenda. We have a tendency to massify and find silver bullets solutions and try to scale it up. We hear a lot of scaling happening in this space, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about the different conditionalities that's being attached, whether they're replicating historical harm, what kind of stakeholder involvement is going on there. So we really need to look backwards before we go forward, and that's kind of at the core of restorative justice as well. And moving forward with our policy program, we're trying to do more kind of engagement-led research. So it's not just the policy team behind the desk kind of writing our reports, is kind of convening stakeholders first, thinking about what kind of just transition futures we're collectively imagining, and then using that as a vehicle to do our research.
Thanks very much, Jodi-Ann. So we'll come back to developing countries shortly. But Tom, let me turn to you. I know we heard from Celine a little bit about skepticism about the call on private finance, and certainly I've sat in many meetings and conferences of this type where the great white knight of private finance is going to come and save us in relation to climate. But the reality is that we're seeing patchy private finance. I know Aviva have done a lot of great work, both in advocacy, but also in innovation, and looking at innovative ways to mobilize private finance. But some other institutions maybe are starting with withdrawal support, particularly given the events in the States. I was wondering if you could comment on how you're seeing the broad landscape for investor appetite right across the spectrum, both advanced and developing economies in the climate space right now.
Thank you, and it's great to be here for this discussion. I think in thinking about that landscape, just to emphasise a couple of the points that have already been made. Absolutely, as you say, we hear a lot about we need private finance to provide the scale. Any of you who have bingo cards this week and have been counting the number of references to the word unlock are going to find that it's come up a lot, as if there is this kind of treasure chest that is locked, and if we just turn the key, money will suddenly flow. And I think we need to be very careful about that. Jodi-Ann talked about silver bullets, and I think, highlighting particular things as if we change one thing, then suddenly private finance will flow is a dangerous fallacy to be getting into. We need to think about actually what the system is set up to do. As Celine was saying, and certainly an observation from last week in Bonn, there is huge residual anger and frustration around the NCQG decision. That core, the 300 billion target, which absolutely should be provisioned, but I think the wording there is broad, and that has upset a lot of developing countries, which is why we saw a 2-day Article 9.1 agenda fight about, we want to put that on the agenda and talk about Article 9.1 again, even though the hope was that the NCQG would provide a 10-year framework for how we were going to deal with that. But it's certainly true that as we think about the role of the private sector in climate finance, in making sure that countries have sufficient finance to fund all aspects of their NDCs. So yes, the mitigation, but adaptation, thinking about the wider context of Article 2 and Article 2.1c, sustainable development, poverty alleviation, knowing that there will be conditionalities in the NDCs that are going to be submitted this year around access to finance. Recognizing that private finance is not well suited to solve all of these problems. So finding the places where private finance can and should play a bigger role, but making sure that that then is freeing up the purely concessional provision type money for those countries which private finance perhaps has a lesser appetite or ability to fill, particularly when we think about the number of actually very small scale but high impact interventions that actually the biggest institutional investors are probably not going to look at unless you have a huge development in the kind of pooling and securitization vehicles to do that. The other thing I think is when we're thinking about this, again, as Celine said, there is this huge skepticism that a focus on private finance is letting the developed countries off the hook. And we have to make sure that we present this as a yes and not alternative. We need to think and set out much more clearly how we, to use a private finance term, build the capital stack for the global transition. We think which bits should be met by what is now, let's face it, a much smaller pot of genuine overseas development assistance. And how can we find the conditions to grow that again after everything we've seen this year, and obviously particularly the impact of USAID being dismantled. But also then, what is the role of the multilateral architecture, the multilateral development banks, national development banks, smaller local banks that can provide some of that smaller finance in local currency, which is actually what a lot of people need. We're having far more conversations, which is a good thing, about blended finance, but that is not going to get us to 1.3 trillion a year. We just have to be clear-eyed about that and realize that in the face of a global economy that is fundamentally misaligned with the transition at the moment, private finance is continuing to flow at scale to activity that is not supporting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that's because economic incentives, which are ultimately set by government in their law, their regulation, their policy, continue not to be aligned either. And until you see the policy to support NDCs being set in national law much more clearly, and that, again, as Celine said, that is a requirement of the Paris Agreement. Article 4.2 is really clear on this. You have to provide policy to give confidence that your NDC can be supported. And it's when we see that and we see the transparency of that. So when governments set out alongside their headline commitments, and one of the things that private finance is doing a lot more in this round of NDCs than I think has happened previously is engaging with countries and saying, we want to see the detail, because the detail is actually what the analysts, the lending committees, the underwriters will look at to assess where should we be putting capital, where should we be taking on risk, and it's the policy environment that sets that. So if we see those policies, we will start to see the global economy and therefore private finance shift. And if we don't, unfortunately, we will continue to see stagnation. And actually, the sheer scale of private finance can either be a huge accelerant or a massive sort of anchor slowing down the transition by providing finance to activity that needs to either transition or is fundamentally misaligned.
Tom, thank you very much. Let me ask you a follow-on question. You mentioned there a call, unusually for financial institution, on stronger regulations and sort of hard infrastructure, if you like, in terms of regulations and legislation. Are there particular aspects of that you think are priorities? I've heard this week, for example, people of course talking about carbon pricing broadly, but also capital weightings and these type of hard levers within the financial system. I wonder if you'd like to comment on what you think would be positive and maybe not so positive in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, exactly as Jodi-Ann said, we should not get hung up on thinking that there is any silver bullet. There is no sluice gate that we can lift that unleashes a torrent of private capital. It will be many different things that shift market sentiment, that shift analysis of where ultimately profit is going to be made. Private finance will flow towards where it anticipates there being future profit. So there are all sorts of things that we either have in the tool or need to take out and sharpen, if you like, from the toolbox. So yes, carbon pricing is going to be one element, but shouldn't be seen as something on its own. If you just left this up to kind of academic economists, they'd say, fine, let's price carbon, let's internalize the externalities, and the market will do its thing. And there will be an element of that. And yes, we do need to see not only pricing carbon, but also definitely need to see follow through on reform of subsidies. I think it's really notable that the global stocktake language on fossil fuel subsidies now specifically refers to phase out of fossil fuel subsidies other than those that contribute to just transitions and fuel poverty. I think that's a positive development, although, as Jodi-Ann says, that concept of just transition means a lot of different things to different people. Again, last week in Bonn, you heard we heard Celine and I happened to be in the same breakout group, and we heard Palau saying we're a negative emitter. None of this conversation seems to apply to us. And you had Saudi Arabia saying for us a just transition is a circular one in which we capture the carbon of the oil and gas resources that we have. talking in essence about the same thing, but in very, very different contexts. So carbon pricing, subsidy reform, you mentioned, financial regulation, and lots of focus has been placed on prudential regulation. I think it's important to review those frameworks that were put in place post-global financial crisis and think, are they including all the things that we now know? Are they finding any inadvertent barriers to capital flowing to support a transition in all economies rather than just developed ones? And I think there's a growing feeling that there may be some of those. Certainly there are some of the mechanisms within the conversation around blended finance and different ways to crowd in private finance that we're hearing. So the use of contingent guarantees, how are they treated under Basel and Solvency II? In the debt sustainability world, how are pause clauses, for example, if they're in instruments, are they matching adjustment eligible for insurers? That's so looking again at some of these frameworks, not throwing them out, but looking again and seeing what tweaks can be made will be a part of this. But actually, we've also, I think, over the last, say, 10 years, focused far too much on regulation of the financial sector and not enough on the regulation of the real economy. Ultimately, although the finance sector does invest in itself, it invests in the real economy. And so regulation of the real economy, providing underneath nationally determined targets, the sectoral plans for where is a country going to prioritize its transition? What's it going to do on its energy mix and infrastructure? What's it going to do on road transport, food and agriculture, buildings, and so on? That will then see money flowing, because those signals, and we're seeing some of them in the UK. We've had the industrial strategy, we've had commitment to investment in certain transition-focused sectors. We've got the government creating the Transition Finance Council and the Net Zero Council, the National Wealth Fund. So there are some things that, without suggesting the UK is getting everything right, some things that the government here is appearing to try to do to provide some of that. And so, yes, we need to think about the regulation of finance. Yes, we need to think about the responsibility, the enlightened self-interest of finance in making sure this transition works. Because if we just keep money in developed country capitals, if money just stays in London, Frankfurt, Tokyo, New York, and doesn't flow to support all countries in their transition, we know that in a globally connected system, huge dependencies lie in developing countries for commodities, supply chain, labor, manufacturing. And in that interconnected world, a transition that doesn't support everybody will lead to trade disruption, will lead to economic instability, and that will impact developed market returns. Therefore, we need to recognize there is a responsibility of private finance in developed countries to play its role here, but it needs to be in dialogue with governments.
Tom, thank you very much. Let me just ask you one fun question. I think yesterday in the FT there was an article calling the next financial crisis relating to climate risks. And obviously there's a lot of discussion at the central banks in relation to macroprudential risk. I'm wondering what you're seeing. I'm interested in when investors in particular are going to see, as we'd like to term it, disorderly divestment from developing countries in particular, but from certain sectors, or whether you think it's being overplayed.
Okay, so first thing to say is if you have not read Political Art's article in yesterday's FT, I commend it to you. I think it's a really important article and worth reading. It's consistent with things that certainly, if you look at three of the biggest insurers in Europe, so Aviva, Allianz, and AXA have all said, we don't think we can insure a 3 to 4 degree world. And if you don't have insurance, you don't have a financial system. Ultimately, there is no bank lending, whether that's to domestic mortgages, whether that's for commercial infrastructure. No bank will lend if it doesn't have insurance over the physical assets that it is taking security over. And to my mind, incredible statement that has received almost no attention in the FCA's adaptation report is that banks shouldn't assume there will be availability of insurance in making lending decisions. And given that every bank assumes that there will be insurance available in its lending decisions, that's extraordinary that no one has written about that. But it's true that we need to see changes to allow a business model and a financial system that is based on the sharing and assessment of risk continuing, because ultimately it is in the interest of all of us that we have financial stability. If you look at, macroeconomically, if you look, there are 2 points pretty much in the graph of global GDP growth, which go down. Only two. One's 2008 and one's COVID, both of which were met by unprecedented fiscal stimulus for government to provide liquidity. And I'm not convinced that any government has the firepower to do that for a climate crisis. So this is something that needs to be avoided as opposed to bailed out. And I think it's true. I mean, there is a tension in the FSB. They wrote a paper with a toolkit for regulators earlier this year, which focused in on the potential withdrawal of insurance coverage in major markets in relation to property. Similarly, last November, the Bank of England's Financial Stability Report suggested that the 1% of UK houses most exposed to flood risk might see the withdrawal of insurance with at least a 20% hit to their house prices. And if you then follow that through, if there's a 20% hit to house prices in 1% of the UK, that will follow through to house prices elsewhere. That will follow through to all sorts of cascading risks. So it's incredibly important from a financial stability point of view that we think about systemic risks. And one of the systemic risks that I believe is on the radar of central banks and supervisors, but they need to work in collaboration with the industry, with governments, to make sure that we take steps that avoid the worst outcomes here. And they happen to be, fortunately, steps that avoid the worst outcomes from a ecological and atmospheric point of view. So cutting emissions, so restoring and protecting nature. So basically, from a financial services point of view, as an insurer, as a pension fund and asset manager, getting to net zero as fast as possible is definitely in our interests, because that is the point at which you stabilize temperature rises and therefore stabilize risk. Then you work out how potentially you either start to get into removals or adapt to what you've got yourself into. But while emissions continue to rise and therefore temperature continues to rise, we are basically on a sort of bedrock of sand in working out how we deal with changing risk.
Thanks very much, Tom. That was a great summary and very insightful. Thank you. Celine, let's go back to you and maybe pick up on some of your remarks. You made a reference earlier to an outsourcing, I think you described it, of responsibilities in the call for private finance to be mobilised. Would you like to expand a little bit more on how you see the role of governments and the private sector, and maybe also reflect on Tom's remarks on that in that regard as well?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think Tom mentioned some of the challenges, and I'm really glad that we're having a conversation about regulation. I think that's a really crucial thing to remember. I think, look, private finance, we have to have private investments to shift to decarbonisation and climate resilience. There's no ifs and buts about it. We've got to bring the private sector along. But I think what we also forget is that the private sector and private investments only work, as like you say, we've got to have the regulatory financial infrastructure in place and the incentives, the regulatory incentives and financial incentives in place for it to happen. And I think one of the issues that's forgotten in, again, this whole just transition aspect is that the participation and representation of different communities and states within different regulatory systems are very asymmetrical. So, developing countries still, and I'd like to push back a little bit on what Sarah said about, collapsing all the distinctions, but there is, as a group, developing countries do have a shared history of colonialism, continued marginalization from the policy-making forums and the law-making forums in the global economy. And I think that's crucial. Where finance is flowing through the international financial architecture, that's the most asymmetrical governance system that we have in relation to any form of lawmaking, or well, there isn't global financial law in the same way that we have trade and investment regimes, for example, which are much more transparent and much more representative of, and where countries and communities through their representatives within national governments, that includes, business within those countries, can actually advocate and then see that transparency of interventions within, and advocacy opportunities are kind of more open within other forums. But within the financial sector, the way that finance regulation is being made, unfortunately, there isn't. And so that's where you have that asymmetries. And the asymmetries between the financial sectors in the global north, in the developed countries, and financial sectors and the real economy and businesses in the developing countries, very, very different, and the interests are very, very different. And I think one of the things about private finance is that it is contingent on government regulation, is contingent on having institutional capacity to develop these policies, to regulate, to be able to provide financial incentives for just transition. And in many developing countries, that institutional that capacity has been weakened through decades of structural adjustment, through deregulation and liberalization that isn't necessarily reflective of their needs, because they're tied into trade and investment agreements and policy conditionalities from the international financial institutions that have actually removed that fiscal space, the policy space, for these governments to be able to actively channel investments and regulate their financial and real economy sectors in the way that developed countries can. And you mentioned industrial policy. I mean, that space has been taken away from most developing countries. They haven't got that space to even begin to navigate that, and put into place that regulation of the real economy. And the issue of insurability, I think it's really important as well. We want to scale up private finance. Private finance is not going to countries because, again, there isn't that capacity in the financing to be able to build up that resilience for example, insurers to even cover flood or heat, drought or any sort of like risks in these countries. So when you talk about, bringing in private investments into developing countries, you've got to have the infrastructure in place. You've got to have the industrial policy space. You've got to have the fiscal space, which a lot of countries don't have because of the debt burden that a lot of developing countries are facing. So it's all tied in to a problematic global economy that has fundamentally been, extractive in most cases to developing countries, and place developing countries already on the back foot when they've come in. So, I think we need to talk about that space that is being limited. So what are we asking of countries? We're talking about a just transition, and a just transition also means just equitable participation in spaces of policymaking and governance, and communities being able to have a say and not be left behind. But at national levels, that's constricted in many, many countries. And that's constricted because of the constraints that I've mentioned above. And further on, we're talking about global governance institutions where developing countries are much, much less represented in those financial spaces of governance. So I think this is where I think the developed countries do need to take a lead on this. Whatever flows, financial flows to developing countries is significantly dependent on what happens in the central bank policies in developed countries. The financial regulators, the pension regulators in developed countries are determining these policies of finance. And that's where, again, developed countries, I think, and I kind of agree with you in that sense, Tom, it's not just about finance, it's not about taking the lead on provision of financing, but also taking the lead in terms of regulation and opening up that spaces for that conversation to happen and taking the lead here. Because developing countries, I know what you're talking about, Sarah, about, other countries, developing countries, should have responsibility. But actually, fundamentally, a lot of these countries still, Singapore doesn't really have much of a voice in the financial system, the global financial system. It's tied into the financial flows that is being determined through the City of London, Frankfurt, New York. These are where the majority of finance transactions, debt contracts are being governed. So again, I think developed countries have that responsibility.
Celine, let me challenge you a little bit though. I'd like to pick up on Sarah's remarks about responsibilities for the large emerging economies. And she mentioned in particular, of course, India and China. And I can see how the remarks that you made would be applicable, particularly to low-income countries. But when we're thinking about these very large emerging economies who have become the largest emitters and some of the largest economies in the world, and certainly have created enormous amounts of wealth for their citizens in recent decades, would your answer be different? How do you see their responsibilities? And maybe you can respond to Sarah's comments that their responsibilities need to shift in terms of claiming exemptions as a developing economy.
So can I ask a question? Because I'm from Malaysia, so probably the only developing country person sitting in this room, right? So can I ask a question? This is always posed to these emerging economies like India and China. Oh, you've got cumulative, but let's talk about not just cumulative emissions, but per capita emissions and also historical emissions. I mean, are you genuinely going to say to even a middle class person in China, you can't have that refrigerator, you can't take your holidays, you can't emit, you can't build and emit to have a train system where the developed countries have for centuries through the Industrial Revolution and beyond, emitted for us to sit here in this beautiful room, built up here, and enjoy all the fruit. These are all, if we look at this infrastructure, that's embedded historical emissions in this room. It's embedded historical emissions in the fact that we're sitting here. Where is our wealth being generated, being here? Are you actually going to say to somebody to China, the Chinese government, they can't emit to give their countries, their citizens and their communities the same level of expectation of standard of living? And that's where I'm going to ask that question. I'm going to, just pose that question every time I get that question asked. Why should developing countries, their emitters? Yeah, but comparatively, they're only doing. I mean, you're telling me in Malaysia, as a Malaysian, I'm not able to travel. That I've got to take, some lowering down of my standard of living compared to somebody here. I mean, Malaysians in general, per capita, emit less, much, much less, right, across the income spectrum than somebody in the West. So I think we need to, when we talk about these countries and their emissions, we've got to look at embedded emissions within our own infrastructure. And I'm just, I've come to the whole climate debate quite late. So, excuse me if I don't get the terminology correct. I've always viewed it as an existential crisis, partly, and this is like a personal thing, it's a cognitive thing. I've avoided dealing with climate as an issue in my research for years because, it's an existential crisis. But where I've come into it, where I have quite expertise, is about the asymmetries between countries and how countries in the global south always being told, you cannot do this, or you're not entitled to that same level of living, of growing as everybody else. And bearing in mind that the countries in the global south are the main suppliers of all the minerals, all, the raw goods that make up the chairs, the woods, the energy transition. So I think we need to think about that before we kind of throw out these kinds of views. So I think it's really problematic, and it's really problematic for me as somebody from the global south to sit here and hear.
So thank you. I think, by the way, we have quite a number of people from countries so defined in the audience. So we're going to be asking Q&A in a few minutes. So I'd ask you to speak up and give your views. I'm going to ask Sarah and then Jodi-Ann to respond to that. And then we'll open the floor for questions and comments.
Thanks, Judith. And thanks, Celine. I really these events are boring if everyone just says the simple stuff, right? I'd much rather we could have a real conversation about it. So thank you for your sort of honesty and passion in this. Look, I think no one would doubt the embedded emissions in the old infrastructure of most of the West, or for that matter, pockets of East Asia as well. I 100% agree. And I don't think, again, the distinction between developed and developing remains problematic here. As I was saying before, I will be one of the loudest critics of the US inaction. 30 years of inaction has set the world on fire. I 100% agree. But I also think, frankly, that Europe is almost single-handedly bearing, and Montek and I were talking about this yesterday, actually, Europe is almost single-handedly borne the cost of any emission reductions that we have achieved so far. The EU is on track for a 55% emission reduction relative to 1990 levels by 2030. UK emissions are currently at 1890 levels. They have through their commitment to renewable energy, for example, Germany's Energiewende, have done so much to drive and through technology transfer partnerships with China, which then obviously has provided the vast bulk of the manufacturing capacity, which you alluded to, but those partnerships have enabled green technologies to become as cost effective as they are. And so there is a lot of embodied emissions here, but the US remains an outsized emitter relative to its population on a vast scale in a way that is less true for Europe. So there's differences there. I think the problem with saying that a person from China or a person from Malaysia is not entitled to the same standard of living, that is fundamentally the issue that has been at the heart of the climate accords since 1992 and in fact earlier. If we have that approach that everyone is entitled to the lifestyle modeled by Los Angeles or Sydney, that is a 5-degree, 6-degree world, and that is a world where no one has a Los Angeles lifestyle except the one that is on fire. I believe that everyone should be having the best possible standard of living, and that living should be much more equitable on a global stage, on a global scale. But we do have to think differently about how we get there. So I've spent a couple of years in Kuala Lumpur, so I can say that Malaysia has chosen an incredibly car-based model. And for other countries now at an earlier stage of building their transport infrastructure, like Indonesia, to choose a public transport-based model that has got higher densities, but still good accessibility to jobs and services, and air-conditioned buses and trains to ensure that they can manage in extreme heat and feel comfortable in extreme heat would be a much more sustainable option. Australia has not gone down that path. I'll hold up my hand and say that. But France has lower per capita emissions than Malaysia and lower per capita cumulative emissions than China or Malaysia. So there's a lot of variation there, and all of us are going to have to demand that our government create systems where we can have a high quality of life with the minimum amount of embodied emissions. And we'll also have to make some choices ourselves to eat differently, to cycle sometimes and to walk sometimes and so on. So I'm 100% on board with equity, but I think there's nuance about equity, and the point we're at now demands that all of us make some trade-offs, and very, very, very tragically, the trade-offs are not going to be equal because of the burden of history.
Come back very quickly on this. Just very quickly, I think, with Malaysia, I think you were there, probably about 10 years ago, and I think there has been a move towards a lot more public transport. In fact, I think the public transport there works better in KL now than, right now. I've just had tube cancellation. So, and also when you're talking about developing countries, you were talking about Singapore initially, which you mentioned, and Singapore has one of the most, I think, efficient public transports. And I think it's the examples that we pick and choose as well. So, and I'm not talking about all of us reaching the right lifestyle for Los Angeles. I'm even talking about just basic things. Refrigeration for medicines, which we take for granted here, but it's an embedded emission. The fact that you've got sufficient energy in the global north, right, to power up your hospitals. I think there were some stats that an American emits more carbon in their 6 weeks of life, as opposed to an average person in East Africa for the first, for their entire lifetime. So again, the stark reality is that many developing countries are still at a stage where you cannot, you're not even being able to have energy access to power refrigeration and keep the lights on in hospitals and in government buildings. So, we're talking about false examples and we pick and choose. And this is the problem, you know, we pick and choose where we are. And maybe, just maybe, the developed countries and communities in developed countries, or the wealthy actually in developed countries, should be made to reduce their emissions by a significant amount so that the average person in the developing country can actually access healthcare and education.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in because I think you're caricaturing me. My whole point is that there's a huge amount of heterogeneity within every country and among these crude categories. Those who are high emitting should be decarbonizing first, and it is unfair and tragic that they're not. We're on the same page, I really think, so I don't want to be misrepresented here.
Can I come in quickly? I made a point earlier about how we need to look backwards before we go forward. And if I go a bit deeper into that, that's a comment on how the just transition has been rendered apolitical, neutral, and this with this tendency to quantify, which is, you know, we get caught up in debates about cumulative emissions when I really think we need to look at historical emissions and per capita. And I'm Chinese, so I think in a lot of these spaces, when China gets brought up, I feel like I need to say something, which is we need to look at the amount of reforestation the country has done in comparison to the rest of the world. We need to look at the amount of renewable energy rollout, because when we talk about renewable energy vis-a-vis China, the first thing everybody says is how much of the value chain it occupies and not how much of renewable energy is rolled out for the people. Of course, there's always challenges with value chains, and the value chains of critical minerals is one of the dirtiest and most insidious ones and embeds a lot of injustice in it. But at the same time, I do think we need to look at, if we're going to talk about just transition, we need to look at the fact that so much of Western countries' growth and development has been externalized onto manufacturing hubs of the world, right? And we cannot ignore that fact when we're talking about just transition now. And that's something that we want to kind of, through the lab especially, talk about this concept of interconnected justice, talk about cross-border impacts, because so much of just transition has been talking about within our national borders, what are we doing, and not about how your transition in the US with Inflation Reduction Act, for example, talking about how much EV rollout is actually could be potentially creating injustices upstream of your value chain in critical mineral sites, and that is completely ignored in those conversations. So a lot of nuance, but I do think that's why restorative justice and ecological justice gets lost in the discussion oftentimes. And that's what I mean by justice and injustice is not mutually exclusive, because when you just fixate on one type of just transition, you will create other injustices elsewhere.
Thanks very much to everyone. I think we've had a really interesting debate, and one that really lies at the heart of what is what is the justice in a just transition as well. And of course, these very hot topics within the climate process. Let me open the floor to questions and maybe comments. If you'd like to put your hand up, please introduce yourself. And if you want to make a contribution, please do, but keep it reasonably brief. Maybe the lady in blue and the lady in pink, as they're the first ones. I'll take one more question, then we'll come to the panel if someone else would like to ask a question. And as your other one, the man in the checked shirt.
Hello, I'm Annabelle Ross, and I'm a visiting fellow with the Just Transition Finance Lab, but also work on sustainability in the capital markets at Lloyds Bank. Thank you for holding that space, because it has to be debated and it's a really tricky topic, so thank you for doing that. My question is, if a genie popped out of the empty water bottle and gave you each one wish, so 4 wishes, how long, well, do you think you can make them, what's the thing, MISI, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, to solve the problem of the just transition? And if you have an idea for your one wish, that would be great to share.
Tom.
No pressure there.
And presumably I'm not allowed to wish for more wishes. So I think, and some of this actually comes to the discussion we've just heard. I think in all of this, it's very easy, and we've just seen what happens when you do, to lump together all developing countries and think that, you know, and try and describe them in the same way. Similarly, though, we do the same with finance. We say private finance needs to needs to provide the problem, and actually without thinking about the different role that different parts of finance play, whether that's early stage venture capital, whether that's private equity, whether that's banks providing structured finance or banks providing commercial finance, insurers, pension funds. So actually disaggregating some of this and thinking about the different roles and the different dependencies on both sides, so on the countryside and on the sources of finance side. So I think actually getting a lot more specific to improve the quality of the discussion.
Let me take the other two questions, and then you can, if the other three of you would like to get, well, you can have your wishes in a minute. Yes, this gentleman.
Hi, I'm
and then the
Gwyn
lady in
Oates
pink.
from the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Question to the whole panel, but it's on one of the things that Celine said at the outset, I think. You said that developed markets have got a moral and ethical obligation to fund into developing markets, which I totally agree with. But I think you also mentioned that there's a legal obligation. And the question to the panel is, what does that legal obligation look like? Does it have teeth? How can that be enforced and actually made to make a difference? Thanks.
Thank you very much. And then just behind you. Thanks, Sadie.
Hi, like lady in pink. Chav Meadle from Climate Policy Initiative. And yesterday I was at a drinking reception and somebody just bluntly told me, that, oh, we're making too much fuss about just transition. It happens all the time. We've moved from from horses, carts to cars, etc. And it'll find its own path. And that made me think that, it is probably a predominant view. And secondly, are we kind of overselling this narrative of being a situation which is win-win? So even for climate finance, we say, oh no, it got growth, it got jobs, etc. Isn't that very important that we need to kind of be more explicit about the trade-offs that we were talking about at country level, but also I was talking more about community level, the trade-offs of, if the coal power plants shut somewhere. And secondly, more practically, like what safeguards and mechanisms should be there, should be plugged in to ensure those injustices not there. And happy to hear any, example from developed countries or where the transition has been really just and how it was, conducted.
Thank you very much. I had slight trouble hearing that question, but I'm going to interpret it. Let me ask the enforcement question. And Celine, would you like to answer that? Because I think you alluded earlier to the need for there to be enforcement of obligations.
I think that's the $1 million question or $1 billion question. I mean, it's a legal obligation. It is there in the climate regime. It's in the UNCCC, it's in the Paris, it's been reinforced, and it's been reinforced through several iterations of, the COPs. But the problem is, and those of you who are international lawyers will know that there's international legal systems that have very clear enforcement mechanisms, very effective ones, such as the international investment regime, which has the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. That's particularly effective. You've got dispute settlement processes within the World Trade Organization. We've got within, which is, I don't want to bring the Trump administration up again, but yeah, that's another issue. But I think within that regime, the climate environmental law regimes in general have very poor enforcement regimes. There isn't a dispute settlement process built in to hold any party to account, and that's why you have these continuous discussion and negotiations about how certain member states have to enforce their obligations, etc. But what I would say, and this probably goes to the second question as well, on the issue of finance, it is quite clear that it has to be new and additional, and I think that part of that has not been brought up so much today in the context of significant cuts to ODA budgets, official development aid budgets, where a lot of the climate finance comes from. And that's where the tension is. You've got declining ODA budgets, and that's being used as a rationale for saying, well, we can't, meet these commitments. But actually, when you look at the text of the convention, when you look at the negotiation history, you'll find that the concept of new and additional is very clear in there, that actually that provision has to be new and additional to any other financing. And I've always personally thought that really means that you cannot use ODA budget for climate finance. So whatever is happening with ODA budgets, that is a separate commitment. That's a treaty commitment that countries have made to provide financing under the treaty, separate to their bilateral commitments of ODA? Actually, my wish is that, given the current geopolitical environment, can we not spend so much money on conflict and wars and actually spend it on climate change? That's my one wish.
So I just, sorry to jump in as the mic came past, but on the question of law and regulation, but from a different point of view, so from the point of view of a regulated financial services business. As I said earlier, I think that the enlightened self-interest of market participants is that to maintain long-term stability of financial markets, this is something we have an interest in contributing to the solving of, albeit that the primary responsibility, as Celine said, lies with government. But if you look at the regulation of finance, say in the UK, and you look at it through the lens of everything we know now about planetary boundaries, about impacts and long-term risks, and you read existing provisions, there's a lot there that you can see very, very differently. So if you think about the pricing of risk, we know that the market's doing a very bad job of pricing long-term risks. And we know that a lot of the time market participants will say, oh, but we don't have sufficient data. But then we have the precautionary principle. Do we have enough data to take a view? But then when you get pushed back against disclosure, that's undermining the price formation process. We don't have the right information to make an accurate assessment of risk. If you look at the differences between what some corporates or entities say and what they're actually doing, then the greenwashing risk undermines fair competition, undermines consumer protection, two of the objectives of the Financial Conduct Authority. If you look at the integrity of the market is something that we have a responsibility to feed back to the regulator about. That is undermined if we have markets that are heading to uninsurability. If you look at the prudential person principle, what would the prudent person of business do if they were minded to make financial decisions on behalf of those people whose money they steward? What would the prudent person of business do if they knew what planetary boundaries were? If they knew what systemic inequalities that undermine financial stability were? So I think we have lots of rules, and I was saying similarly with prudential, lots of rules that fall to be reinterpreted in light of everything we now know.
Tom, thanks very much for that. Sarah, maybe I can ask you to pick up on the question about trade-offs, but also about the comments that have been made about the ODA landscape. As we know, ODA has shrunk globally. We're seeing a sort of traction against commitment, certainly against the 0.5 of GDP commitment. It's a scarce resource. How would you allocate it, and what would the trade-offs be that you would make? And don't forget your wish.
I was going to start with my wish. Great question. Well, actually, my wish picks up a little bit on what Celine was saying, which is that I wish that the ministries of defense thought differently about security, which is to say, what are the two major threats? We've talked a lot about the West. It's actually, the climate context, it should be developed countries of Japan, but let's say the West, the two big threats to the West over the last 20 to 30 years. And one of them is obviously Russia. And the other has been, rightly or wrongly, has been terrorism sponsored by a subset of nations in the Middle East. And that has been, but all of those threats have been financed by oil. And so a very concerted effort by the largest fossil fuel consuming nations of the West to get off oil and gas would have done a huge amount to reduce their defense spending needs, which are now set to be, after the most recent NATO summit, at 5% of GDP. That is the kind of response at a minimum that we should be having to climate change. And instead, as Celine said, we're using it to unnecessarily kill young men at the front lines and destroy territory and infrastructure. And that is a tragedy now, and it's going to be more of a tragedy as climate change accelerates. So my wish is that's my wish. If my wish was solved, we would have more odor and we'd be doing less discussion about trade-offs. But as it is, maybe let me say, I see this real tension when we talk about just transitions and ODA, because fundamentally we want two things that are completely different from ODA. So the first thing is that we want lots of grant finance to go to the very poorest and most vulnerable people to whether that is to help them adapt or to redress loss and damage, or whether it's to manage the just elements of the transition. So to help with the reskilling and retraining of fossil fuel workers, the remediation of polluted areas in the Niger Delta, whatever that might be. But the other thing that we want from scarce concessional finance is to use it to make a much more enabling environment for private investment so that the transition accelerates and we see much less fallout from runaway climate change. So we use it to make projects more bankable, or we use it to stimulate creditworthiness of entities. And even if ODA levels had not fallen cataclysmically in the last 2 years, there wouldn't be enough to achieve either one of those goals. But it's going to be much harder to do both with where concessional finance sits at the moment.
Thank you very much, sir. Jodi-Ann, I'll come back to you later, but maybe we could take some more questions. Have we got some more hands? This lady here at the front in the beige. Do you have other questions as well? If you want to put your hand up so we can see where you are.
Thanks for that. Really interesting. I find it, I guess, maybe observation leading to a question.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry. I'm Greta. I work for ERM and Sustainability Consulting Company. So as soon as we started talking about the just transition and the responsibilities, we kind of went immediately to what do we do as people? So what is the transport that we're using? What are the choices that we're making in our daily lives? And we're limited in our ability to make some of those choices and make low carbon choices because not all cities have public infrastructure. When you take a flight, I think everyone should travel. I think everyone should be able to, but you take a flight and it's a high emission activity because there's not enough sustainable aviation fuels. And I just find it interesting that the conversation immediately went to what are we as people doing individually? And I think my question is, how do we shift that back to what companies should be doing? How do they reduce their emissions per products that they produce, for products that they sell, for the flights that they sell? I think part of that is at the government level, but then I think a lot of it is also just in how companies act, the provision of their finance. And I wonder just if someone, whoever, can just speak to what they think would take to make it happen so that companies, the onus of this returns to the companies as the producers of the products and the services that we want to live and to get to, a stable standard of living for everyone that is acceptable.
Thank you very much. Do you have anyone else? Yeah, in blue, Alex.
So thank you. So Alex Weston, I'm also at the Just Transition Finance Lab as a policy analyst. I had a question for Tom. When it comes to kind of how do you provide financial institutions or companies with clear signals on what the transition risk is of emitting emissions? Do you actually think that this can be achieved, these clear signals can be achieved through instruments other than actually pricing the carbon? And do you think that subsidies or other kind of instruments, government regulations can actually provide the necessarily kind of clear and translatable signal for companies or financial institutions to be able to make clear assessments on investments and how to kind of mobilize capital into different areas? Thank you.
Do we have one more? Gentleman in pink. Actually, I'll take a fourth one.
Hello, Andreas Kokinis from the University of Birmingham, a legal academic. So the question is, if I think a lot came across the discussion, there was a lot of like rules we want to change at international level, national level, enforcement, but often the difficulty is the state of the public debate, right? So I think I would ask all the panel their thoughts about a strategy of communication of those principles, issues that could bring them to the broader public, and could thus mitigate the current political situation, which is that, climate skepticism, climate change denial is on the up everywhere, including in Europe, including in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And one final question at the front here, please. Sorry.
Thanks. Rosie Hurst. I'm on the Strategy Council of the lab. I just wanted to dive down into the real economy briefly and get us to think a little bit about the millions of migrant workers who have fueled economic growth over the past 25 years in countries like Malaysia and Singapore, and indeed here, largely migrant workers. There is no sign of improvement in working conditions amongst clean energy producers, for example. So it's the same shipyards in Singapore that make offshore wind installations as make oil rigs. And the forced labor, which carries on in those sites, remains exactly the same. How can we stimulate a universal improvement in job quality to make the transition really just?
Thank you very much. Yeah, then we have to pass around this. That'd be great. Jodi-Ann, I'm not sure which of the questions you would like to ask. I know which I would ask you, but your wish can be that you can choose your own.
I spent some time talking about no silver bullets, and then it's hard to say one wish from that. But I do think aside from defense, I would like to see critical scholarship and policy speak more to each other. I just came from 3 days of critical academic panels and in international development where we're talking about the just transition, and people are talking about Nancy Fraser's conceptualization of justice, blah, blah, and I think I cannot take this to, London Climate Action Week and many of the events that are happening here, because, when critical scholarships speak to policymakers, there's like complexity overwhelm, right? And when policy speaks to critical scholarship, it's like you're just not talking about this holistically enough. So I think the two need to really link to each other more. And related to the communications point, if I can kind of take a sliver of your question and address it there, we really need to simplify a lot of these innovative, efficient financial instruments that's coming online, because the everyday people don't understand it. The people who are on the receiving end of it don't understand it. And that can be a source of problems, right? So, and that breeds a lot of mistrust, it breeds a lot of misunderstandings. So finance is known as a very opaque field. Some argue purposely, others argue inadvertently, but we need to make a lot of these information of how they work much more accessibly.
Thank you very much. Sarah, maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about around the question of green jobs, and particularly green jobs as they're materializing in the informal sector. If you'd like to touch on the informal sector more broadly, please do.
Thanks. And thanks. That's a really interesting question. I guess maybe just to say, for many years, I think LSE has been at the heart of this, and ODI and a few other organizations have worked very hard to tell the positive story of climate action, because there really is one, cleaner air, more physically active and healthy lifestyle, and this bonanza of green jobs is so often the one that gets people's attention. And I think it's, to be honest, I think it's not quite true. In that a lot of those green jobs, most of those jobs are in building retrofit or in construction. And those are not necessarily, as you alluded to, always very good jobs, and they're not always very long-term jobs in the same way that working in a factory that continues to manufacture might be. That's not to say there aren't some great green jobs out there, but I think there's a need for honesty and consideration about this. But I think that wasn't quite your question, and so maybe I can just try and tackle that a little bit, which is I see one of the really big challenges on climate policy, and you see this in the vast sprawling proliferation insanity that is the UNFCCC, that everyone wants to see their thing there, because climate change is, as someone said earlier, it's this existential crisis, it's this all-consuming future, and it is going to lead to a very profound social and economic change. So this is our chance to fix gender inequality, and this is our chance to fix poverty, and this is our chance to fix working conditions, and this is our chance to, and I think it risks clouding the space, and I think it risks putting an unequal onus on climate action relative to what we have seen in dirtier sectors. So, you know, at the moment, we're doing a lot of work in Nigeria, and there is this strong narrative about Nigeria's need for a just transition. And that would be amazing, do not get me wrong. And I absolutely think policymakers should pursue that aggressively. But let's be clear that oil and gas in Nigeria is not just. Like, you know, at the moment, you have a wildly unequal society with an elite propped up by oil and gas revenues, and the places that are home to the oil and gas reserves are suffering an eco-genocide of pollution and poverty and destroyed livelihoods and unhealthy children. And so a just is a focus on a just transition and defining what justice looks like and having those processes going to prevent tackling the injustices associated with a fossil fuel economy, or having an economy-wide approach to redistribution and to decent working conditions and so on. And so I think a little bit like Jodi-Ann was saying, you know, that no silver bullet. I think we should be really committed to labour rights, and we should be really committed to climate action, and we shouldn't be talking about labour rights just in the context of installing solar panels.
Yeah, I have to say, I'll chip in there, particularly about labour rights, broadly defined in the informal sector as well. It's not just about labour rights as we might think about it in developed countries. Celine, I'm going to ask you to go back to, and particularly might like to respond, of course, any question of your choice, but maybe about how we can improve public debate, you know, both at a micro level and at a macro level.
Yeah, I think this is actually quite a good question, given the context of this roundtable and just transition. And again, going back to the notion of just transition is ensuring that when we transition, we have to make it orderly, because a disorderly transition is unequal. It's destabilizing, as Tom was saying. It will cause all sorts of crises if we don't think about it, but it will also leave people behind. And that's where the communications also fail, and good communications can only be predicated on good policy. So if you have, for example, in developed countries, in the UK and in Europe at the moment, and in the US, a very, very strong resistance to any climate action, it's because people are left behind, and we need to understand that. We need to understand the unequal societies that developed countries have. And that's something that, again, when we're collapsing distinctions, but I'm uncollapsing them. I'm being a bit more nuanced here. And we have to recognize that people have been out of a job. So when you move, when you transition, and it's disorderly and it's unequal, you will lead to these communication. It's not a communication problem, because actually, fundamentally, the policies have been disorderly. And so the action has to be with those who hold political and financial and economic power in this world, because that's a very small slice of the elites that are not doing the justice in the sense that Jodi-Ann had talked about, in terms of redistributive, reparative justice, in any sense. And that resistance comes from those who are holding the capital. And that's a very small subset. So I think the communications, yes, we can improve it, but we need to speak to people's lives. You know, a person who is struggling to heat their home, right, is not going to be susceptible to any flashy communication about the fact that they need to reduce their emissions and that they are responsible for, a person in Zambia not being able to access vaccinations because they haven't got fridges in their community. So that solidarity, I think we need to build global solidarity movements in the way that labor movements used to be more global and internationalized from below many, many years ago, where there is this understanding that there is a global movement of peoples and communities that have a very shared value and interest in just transition.
Thank you very much, Celine. The final answer, Tom, I think there's a question about subsidies or about what would be the market triggers. Can I ask you to answer that question, particularly in relation to ODA, and a little referring to Sarah's comments earlier? Where, in relation to private finance, where do you think ODA should be applied?
So if I take the question first, and then your kind of add on with ODA, I mean, as I said, carbon pricing may be one element, but you have a whole range of things. You phase out certain technologies, you put sunset dates, and you will see that, we've seen this with electric vehicles. You will see innovation, capital, and it will shift. Some things may need to be outright banned, right? You provide positive subsidies for things we want more of, and yes, you probably tax things we want less of. So it's one part. As I said, if the pure kind of economic theory answer was going to work, we'd have fixed it by now. So I think it's thinking about smart use of the range of options that are available to policymakers, but it's also about businesses and financial institutions pushing businesses, recognizing that they will come up against the kind of policy and in some cases market failure horizon, and that's where you need then advocacy to try and shift that. But you say, right, what can you do? For example, in developed countries, where is your plan for your transition, and how are you factoring both supply chain and worker and those sorts of important elements of the transition into what you're thinking? In terms of the question about ODA and private finance, I think one of the things is, as I said, I think in my first remarks, you've got this fundamentally misaligned financial system. If you take steps that will change that, which will change incentives in the global system, and to be honest, I'm really, really pleased to see the Brazilians focus in their action agenda on implementation of the global stocktake, because my view is if you implement the outcomes from the global stocktake, not just the energy outcomes, important as though they are, but there are also outcomes on nature, there are outcomes on regulatory and incentive environments for finance in the private sector. Implement that and the global economy shifts. I genuinely believe that. And if that happens, what you then find is that as you move down the development scale, more and more private finance will find a home in middle income countries, in some of the, and then again, this is going back to my capital stat point. What you do then is you work out, you push private finance as far down as it can go, probably kind of uncomfortably comfortably. Plus then you think about how do you use the public finance, the multilateral development banks as efficiently as possible. And then you will get to the stage where there will be some things that will need to be funded by overseas development systems.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll hand back to Nick, but to the panel, thank you very much. It's wonderful. I'm sure Nick will like to make some further debates. And thank you to the audience for the questions.
So thanks to you, Judith, for moderating that session perfectly. Thanks to Sarah, thanks to Jodi-Ann, thanks to Tom, and thanks to Celine. So as I say, I think this was a very rich discussion, and it was good that we actually had, it created some fire and some disagreements. And I was looking, as we were discussing, the two founders of the LSE behind us, Sydney and Beatrice Webb, coming out with great thoughts about how we look at the roots of things and how we create social benefit. And in the center of that, of course, is a coal fire. This is the fireside chat that we've been having. So I think maybe that we're going to have to sort of reform the picture, so we have a different type of picture. I think what came out of this was a sense that the just transition is deeply contested. But I think, Celine, towards the end, you highlighted a thing, recognizing that the just transition comes out of people's movements. It comes out of the trade union movement, human rights, civil society, and so on. And what we're trying to do is really say how that passionate bottom-up agenda connects with the complexities of the financial system, as we heard. And at the moment, we've heard that it goes clang. Yeah, it doesn't really connect very well. But we have some things to hold on to, which I think were interesting to go forward. I think more work on how public finance, domestic and international, can be aligned with just transition in terms of labor rights, human rights, and so on. More work thinking about the architecture of the global financial system. Debt came up. More questions about actually how private finance, which can either be a drag on transition or can be an accelerant, how that could work. We didn't discuss, but one of the things that has been coming up in climate change in the Climate Week is actually transition plans, both at a national level and at a company level. How do they incorporate just transition factors? And again, something we didn't discuss, but I think bottom-up finance, community finance, and so on. How can communities be enabled to have the assets to fulfill their futures? So I think a very rich discussion. The Just Transition Finance Lab has been very much focused on the how we make the transition, how we mobilize different forms of finance, how we reform it. And I think this has really set the pace for the next year of our work. So you'll hear more from us, more in terms of particular financial instruments. Judith, work you're leading, more on global policy reform, Jodi-Ann. We have many other colleagues in the room. We've got Rob there, who's been working on metrics and so on, case studies and so on. So we want to take the richness of this high-level agenda. I can see Sangeet right in the corner. He's working on India. Take this contested agenda, and out of that, deliver work that delivers on climate and nature goals, but does that by really thinking about moving finance in the right direction. We start with an unjust past, an unjust present. The key is to have a just transition to a more inclusive and sustainable economy. So thank you all very much for coming, and thanks again to the panel.